Hello everybody, today's true crime story is a good one. It has the makings for essentially a movie, honestly. It's got a little bit of theft, a little bit of murder, a little bit of escape from prison, a lot of craziness. So strap in and let's start the story of Gary Evans, the best friend killer, I guess? Gary Evans was born in 1954 in Troy, New York. So Gary Evans was essentially raised in the perfect serial killer petri dish household. The germs that were his parents were essentially grooming him to be a serial killer. His mother and father were both alcoholics and would essentially abuse both him and his sister Robbie. Growing up, Gary was a straight A student. He was super smart. He had all of the potential to do great things, but his parents were just scum, germs, petri dish. His parents were very religious. They would make them go to Sunday school every single Sunday. Gary received awards at church for never missing a day. However, when church was over, behind the closed doors of the Evans family's house, Gary's father beat the crap out of him. His father was physically and sexually abusive towards Gary. His mother was a suicidal alcoholic. She would attempt suicide so regularly that they didn't even take it seriously anymore. There was one instance where they were all sitting down in the living room as a family, and Gary's mother pulled out a handgun and stuck it to her head. Gary's dad essentially laughed, ripped the gun out of her hand, and said, "Do you want to know what it's like to be shot?" and shot her in the shoulder. Like, this family is crazy. Gary and his sister Robbie would be tied to the kitchen chairs and forced to eat food that they didn't like, which pretty much consisted of liver and onions. Then Gary would be tied up in the basement where he was physically beat and sexually abused by his father. People living in the same neighborhood as his family said that they never came outside. Gary and his sister were never seen. They were always confined to the house and never had fun. Gary was so starved for affection that at the age of 8, he snuck out of the house, went to a jewelry store, and stole a $1,000 necklace. He brought it back home and gave it to his mother. Now, if your 8-year-old child snuck out of the house and brought you a $1,000 necklace, your first thought as a good parent should probably be, what the hell are you doing? Do not steal necklaces. This was bad. Let's go take it back and apologize to the store owner. However, Gary didn't grow up in that type of household. Gary's mother actually thanked him for it and cherished the necklace. Like, it was something that she wanted Gary to keep doing. She loved that Gary was giving her nice things, and she didn't really care that he was stealing them. Since Gary's mother didn't punish him for stealing the necklace, it essentially opened the door for Gary to steal whatever he wanted. He constantly stole stuff. It actually got so bad that when Gary was in grade school, he was known as being the thief of the school. Gary's childhood was so crazy that Gary's mother would actually bring home live animals and butcher them in front of the kids to show them where their food came from. What psychopaths. This type of emotional abuse from his mother led Gary to start doing the exact same thing to animals. He would start abusing the neighborhood animals. He would kick them, hit them, abuse them. This was obviously one of the telltale signs that this kid might grow up to be a serial killer. Gary's parents ended up divorcing in 1968 when Gary was 14 years old. Gary had a choice to make. He could either live with his abusive father or his suicidal alcoholic mother that liked to kill animals in front of him. This made Gary snap a little bit. He increased the amount of times he actually pulled off some thefts. He also then moved in with his mother and began to work out like crazy because he was so sick of his father abusing him and his family. He decided that he was going to work out so much just to be big enough to take on his father and stop the abuse. He was quickly able to do that. This guy was ripped. He was huge. He was under 6 feet tall and built like a bodybuilder. He was working out literally every day, which you would think would be a good way to revert his aggression into something positive. However, he was working out so that he could basically kill his father. Now that Gary was a little older, he was starting to build his confidence, and the petty theft game was actually becoming boring. So he decided to up his game a little bit and started breaking into houses. He was now 16 years old and got caught breaking into someone's house. He was sent to juvie for 3 months. While he was inside, On the outside, his family was still going crazy. Both parents were still alcoholics. Both parents were still abusive. His mother and father were finally split. However, everything just continued. It was so bad that in the 3 months Gary was in juvie, his mother got married 4 times and divorced 4 times. Oh, and also, after all 4 of these divorces, she decided to give up on men and became a lesbian. Gary was released from juvie in early 1971 just to come home to all of this craziness. He found out that his mom had been married and divorced 4 times and was now a lesbian. He found out that his dad was still abusive. Everything was just going to shit. Not having anywhere to go, he was forced to move in with his mother, but they fought constantly. He was 16 and decided that the constant battle between his parents and himself and fighting with his mother wasn't worth it, and he decided to move out of the house. He was basically living on the streets at the age of 16. He survived on the streets by his keen ability to steal things. He was really good at it, until he wasn't. By the mid-70s, Gary was back in Troy, New York, and started hanging out with some childhood friends. Michael Falco and Timothy Reisdorf were childhood friends of Gary and would basically get into the same trouble that Gary did while growing up. So naturally, this trio fit perfectly together. They decided to make a pact and would start robbing things together to increase the amount of loot they could get. During the 70s and 80s, Gary continued his criminal career, but was now getting into trouble a lot more. He was getting caught all the time. He was in and out of jail to the point where he actually built a relationship with a lot of the police officers. They knew exactly who he was. The trio would steal anything they could get their hands on and basically made a makeshift store out of their house to sell all of the stolen goods out of. Between 1971 and 1991, Gary was arrested 22 times. He was charged with 15 felonies during that time. Most of the times he was arrested, he did spend a little bit of time in jail, but since he knew all the police officers, he basically became like an informant. If the officers needed to know something, he would tell them and shorten his sentences in jail. So he kind of had a good system worked out here. Every time he was released from jail, he would move back in with Timothy and Michael and just start stealing again. It was a continuous cycle. In 1977, Gary was arrested for the umpteenth time and was sentenced to 4 years in prison. While he was in prison, his father passed away. Gary was noted saying that he wished he would have been the one to kill him. He was released in 1980, but was nabbed again shortly after his release. He was basically one of the worst criminals now. He went from being a young, really good criminal to now, when he's older, he just keeps getting arrested. However, this time when he was in prison, he befriended some Hell's Angels and actually convinced them to throw him over a wall and escape jail. It was noted that Gary dared the Hell's Angels and would basically provoke them by saying, "You couldn't throw me over the wall." And obviously these Hell's Angels were big dudes, so they grabbed him and literally threw him over the wall of the prison, and that's how Gary made his escape. However, the escape didn't last long. Gary was able to make it across the street to a library where he actually went on the roof and was surrounded by police officers. Gary stepped onto the ledge of the library roof and threatened to jump. After a little time, negotiators were able to get Gary off the ledge and get him back into custody. It was at that time that Gary ratted out the Hell's Angels friends that he had made and was put in solitary confinement because he was afraid for his life. Come on, Gary. Don't rat out your friends, buddy. So Gary was now back in prison, and then he got word that his mother had died. So this was a bad prison sentence for him. During this sentence, his father and mother had now passed away. The way Gary's mother had died was quite crazy. She actually slipped on some ice, hit her head on her car, passed out, and because it was cold out, she froze to death. Now, Gary's life is pretty much spiraling out of control. Not that he had a great relationship with his parents, but it's your parents, and they both died, and now he is just kind of lost. It's now 1985, and Gary is finally released from prison again. Now that Gary is out of prison, he's in desperate need of money. So he decided to pose as a drug dealer. Somehow he was able to lure a few willing participants that wanted some drugs. Gary said that he had $12,000 worth of marijuana that he wanted to sell. He told these people to bring the $12,000 and he would give them like $20,000 worth of weed. So at the exchange spot, Gary was handed the $12,000 and just ran. So now these guys that just handed Gary $12,000 in cash are watching him sprint across the street to get away. And Gary, being kind of a little guy and built and muscular, he was actually able to get away. So these drug dealers were shooting their guns, trying to kill Gary. Gary actually planned this out pretty well. He was able to escape and thought that they would never contact the police because how are they going to tell the police that they just lost $12,000 in a drug deal? So Gary was actually pretty smart on this one. Gary does get away, and to taunt these people even further, he circles back knowing that he got away and ends up stealing their car as well. Gary. So this was like the one thing that Gary actually did pull off that got him a ton of money, and he didn't get caught for it until the people that he screwed over actually did call the cops and told the police that Gary stole their vehicle and there was $12,000 in there. They didn't say anything about the weed. So now the cops are after Gary again. So the same day that Gary is driving around in this car, he ends up running a red light and the police pull him over. Or at least try to. Gary is like, hell no, I'm not going back to prison, so he guns it. While the police are chasing him, he throws out his ID and a handgun. Gary, well, while the police are chasing you, don't throw out your identification, telling them exactly who you are. That's not a good idea, buddy. So not surprisingly, Gary got caught again and was sent back to prison. This time, in prison, because he's so friendly, he makes another friend. This friend is the son of Sam serial killer David Berkowitz. Now, him and David bonded over weightlifting. They got along very well because they were both very into fitness. They became such good friends to the point that they would actually write each other while in prison and probably wrote each other even after as well. Gary was released from prison again and went right back to his wolf pack, Timothy and Michael. And we're the three best friends that anyone could have, and we're the three best friends that anyone could have, and we'll never, ever, 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 ever leave each other. There you go. If you don't know that one, it's from The Hangover, so you should probably go watch it. It's a really good movie. So Gary, Timothy, and Michael are all back together. The dream team is back at it, robbing places. They began robbing jewelry stores across the area. Now, the pack is starting to become a little uneasy. So Timothy is in Gary's ear and basically saying, hey, I think Michael is stealing from us. He's taking some jewelry for himself and not splitting it 3 ways, and this pisses Gary off. So while Michael is out in the garage loading up a car, Gary makes like a makeshift silencer for his pistol, and he goes out into the garage and confronts Michael. Now, there was a specific necklace that Gary was missing that he really wanted, and now that Timothy told him that Michael was stealing, he basically had all the evidence he needed to blame Michael for taking the necklace. So he went into the garage and confronted Michael about it. Michael was like, dude, I didn't take your necklace. Like, I'm all in. I'm splitting all of this stuff. And Gary loses it. He shoots Michael in the back of the head while he's loading something into the car. As Michael's body is falling, Gary kind of just ushers him into the trunk of the vehicle. So Michael's now dead, and Gary goes back into the house to get Tim and is like, hey, Tim, come out to the garage. I have to show you something. Tim and Gary go out to the garage, and Gary shows him that he killed Michael and says, get in the car or I'm killing you next. So Gary and Tim drive Michael's body all the way to Florida and bury him. Gary and Timothy spent a little over a month in Florida just stealing stuff and being kind of vagrants. After about a month, Gary and Tim returned to New York, and Gary befriended another thief named Damien. Now, Gary really liked Damien, and they began stealing stuff together. In 1989, Gary and Damien broke into an antique store together. They did it at night, thinking that the antique store would be closed and no one would be there. However, the shop owner, Douglas Barry, was actually sleeping in the back room. Gary startled Douglas awake, ended up shooting and killing him, then looting the whole store and took off. They got away with over $15,000 in antiques. After this heist, Gary and Damien started splitting their loot up. After Damien gave Gary his cut, Gary was underwhelmed. He thought they for sure stole more items than that. So again, Gary got upset and thought Damien was stealing from him. So Gary started watching Damien very closely. 3 months after the antique store heist, Damien began experience depressive episodes. Gary was super concerned over this and thought Damien might actually snitch on him if given the opportunity. So Gary ended up handcuffing Damien behind his back and shooting him in the head 3 times, killing him. He then wrapped his body in a shower curtain and buried him in a pre-dug grave. So he was thinking about this for a long time and actually dug a grave in preparation for killing Damien. After he killed Damien and buried his body, Gary took off to Florida again. Now you might be thinking, Gary is deranged. He's killed 2 people, but the story gets even worse. Damien is now considered a missing person because no one has seen him for so long. 1 month after Gary killed Damien and everyone is still searching for him, Gary decides to reach out to Damien's girlfriend and begin a relationship with her. They became boyfriend and girlfriend and were sexually active throughout this whole thing. Not only did he kill Damien, he went and started dating his girlfriend. This is beyond sick. It's now 1991 and Gary is working as a lone wolf again. He broke into a jewelry store and immediately shot the store owner, Gregory Jobin. The store owner died shortly after. Gary is now basically killing for fun. After killing the jewelry store owner, he robbed the store of $60,000 worth of gems. He then fled to Colorado. While in Colorado, Gary decided that he wanted to get rid of the murder weapon, so he went to a local cemetery and buried the gun in a box. While at the cemetery, Gary couldn't help himself and ended up stealing a huge marble tombstone. Somehow he was able to use like a crane to get this 1,000-pound marble tombstone like into a vehicle, and oddly enough, he was able to sell it. However, Gary's a terrible thief. He was able to sell the tombstone, but he got busted for it. He was charged with looting, vandalizing, and selling a tombstone. Being a habitual offender, he was looking at some pretty steep charges and some pretty long sentences in jail. So he worked out a deal that he would actually be an informant for the police and try to get someone in prison already to confess to a murder. So Gary ended up spending about a month in prison befriending this person and actually did get them to confess to a murder. So Gary's sentence was basically commuted. After his release from jail, he moved to Vermont. Wikipedia says that he lived a survivalist lifestyle, which I feel like is probably just a nice way of saying that he was homeless. However, he couldn't help but to revert back to his original lifestyle of stealing. In 1993, he actually got caught stealing a really expensive book from a library. Due to the value of the book, he was sentenced to 2 years in prison. He was paroled in 1996 and moved back to New York. While back in New York, Gary met up with his longtime friend, Tim Reisendorf. Now, if you remember, Gary and Tim go way back. Gary killed Michael and made sure that Tim helped him bury the body. Now at this time, it seemed like Tim was trying to turn his life around. He was married, and according to his wife, he was turning it around. He was doing well. He was holding a job, and everything was going pretty well. Enter Gary, and now Tim reverts back to his lifestyle as well. They are now back to their duo and are stealing things again. They ended up renting out a storage unit to put all of their loot in and basically have a store out of this unit. Over the next several months, Tim and Gary experienced a lot of success. They were bringing in a ton of money. That is, until one day, Gary was having a conversation with Tim's wife and noticed a necklace around her neck. Gary basically looked at her and said, "Nice necklace." And she said, "Thanks. Tim bought it for me." After taking a closer look, Gary realized that was the necklace that he had been missing and actually killed Michael for. So now this story does a full 180. Gary now knows that Tim was lying to him, and Tim was actually the one taking more profit under the table and not splitting it 3 ways like he should have been. He basically killed Michael for no reason. Now Gary is pissed. On October 3rd, 1997, Gary confronted Tim in the storage unit that they had been working out of. While Tim wasn't paying attention, Gary pulled out his gun and shot him 3 times in the head. In a fit of rage, Gary then took a chainsaw and dismembered him. He put all of Tim's body parts in a bag, then buried the bag in a shallow grave. This time, Gary was on parole from a previous violation, and when he tried to flee New York like he always did after killing someone, his parole officer notified the police and a warrant was issued for his arrest. Investigators are now starting to piece things together. There are 3 people that Gary was close with. All 3 of them are missing, and now Gary is on the run. Michael, Damien, and Timothy were all missing, and Gary was the common denominator. Police were finally able to catch up to Gary in Vermont about 7 months after he had killed Timothy. Now this time, Gary thought he was going to be questioned about robbing something again. However, investigators actually started questioning him about the disappearances, and this kind of threw Gary for a loop. He wasn't used to answering questions like this. It was now becoming like a high-intensity interrogation, and Gary broke. Gary confessed to all 5 murders, the 2 store owners, and the 3 friends that he had murdered. He even led investigators to the buried bodies. At this point, the police were so familiar with Gary that they actually made him call Damien's girlfriend, well now I guess the girlfriend that Gary had for a while, and tell her that he killed Damien. She obviously broke down and lost it. She was brought into this spiral of crazy, thinking that she could trust Gary, and Gary basically told her that everything was his fault. So now Gary was formally charged with all 5 murders, but the story doesn't end here. 2 days after being charged with the murders, Gary was being transported to prison and ended up escaping the transport vehicle. And how he escaped is gonna baffle you, so hold on. So he had somehow gotten his hands on a spare key and was able to unlock his handcuffs, kick out the window, and basically jump out of the vehicle. Gary was now running from police, but was quickly surrounded as he was on a bridge and didn't really have anywhere to go. So Gary climbed up onto the edge of the bridge and jumped. He fell 60 feet into about 6 inches of water, so it was a very hard landing for him. During the autopsy, it was revealed that Gary had been chiseling away at the sinuses in his nose, and there was enough room in there to hide a key. Want to know how they know there was enough room to hide a key? They actually pulled one out from his nasal cavity. They also discovered a razor blade and another makeshift key taped to his leg. So it's pretty safe to say that Gary had kind of planned this whole thing out and knew that he was going to try to escape. He was going to pretty extreme lengths to make sure that he never ended up in prison again. That is the crazy true crime story of Gary Evans. Please, if you liked this video, subscribe to my page for more content. Bye, everybody.